Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who called 911 because I was swimming in the pool. I've been wanting to share this wild saga for quite a while, mostly because it still boggles my mind how far some people will go just to cause trouble. My story starts with a simple desire. I wanted to spend some quality time in my own backyard pool. Sounds harmless, right? Little did I know my choice of summertime relaxation would spark a series of bizarre events involving a very jealous neighbor, multiple confrontations, and a massive legal headache. By the end, I'd learned just how sneaky some folks can be, and how important it is to stand up for myself when my rights are threatened. Now, to set the stage, I live in a fairly peaceful neighborhood. It's one of those suburban areas where most homes have decent-sized yards, driveways that can fit 2 or 3 cars, and a calm street where kids sometimes skateboard in the evenings. My property happens to have a relatively large backyard, which came complete with an in-ground pool when I bought it several years ago. It wasn't particularly new, but it was well-maintained and had a sturdy fence around it as per local regulations. Not every house on the block has a pool, which I always assumed was just a matter of personal preference and finances. Some neighbors put their resources into elaborate gardens. Some prefer decks or patios, and I guess I ended up with the pool option. For years, the pool didn't cause any problems. In fact, it became a bit of a community perk. Now, I never randomly invited everyone over, but I didn't mind letting a trusted friend or neighbor swing by for a dip if they asked politely. At one point, a kind-hearted couple across the street asked if they could use my pool for a quick swim on a hot day when their home air conditioning broke. Since we had a friendly relationship, I agreed. They brought their own towels, cleaned up after themselves, and we shared a pitcher of lemonade. That's the kind of rapport I enjoyed with the people on my street, until new folks moved next door. A little background. The previous residents next door were lovely people. They had 2 dogs that occasionally barked but never disturbed us beyond that. They moved for job reasons, and the house was on the market for a while until this new family moved in. I didn't see much of them at first. I saw moving trucks, a few cars, and the typical hustle and bustle that comes with moving into a new house. I even walked over one afternoon to say hello, but nobody answered the door. I left a small note in the mailbox welcoming them and letting them know I was happy to help if they needed anything. I didn't hear back, which I took to mean they were busy settling in. No big deal. A few weeks passed and the weather started to heat up. Naturally, I began my usual routine of early evening swims. Sometimes I'd do laps for exercise. Other times I'd just float around on a large inflatable lounge while sipping iced tea. It was my way of winding down after a long day at work. After a handful of these evenings, I noticed my new neighbors standing on their back porch, staring in my direction. I didn't think much of it beyond a brief, awkward wave. They just stood there as if sizing me up. I remember thinking, well, maybe they're just curious about who lives next door, and left it at that. One weekend afternoon, I was hosting a small barbecue with some friends. Nothing wild, just a few folks from my workplace, a couple of old classmates, and a friend who lived down the street. We had maybe 10 people total, cooking burgers and hot dogs, and occasionally someone would hop in the pool. I kept music at a moderate level to avoid disturbing anyone. Around dusk, I heard what I thought was an argument coming from the neighbor's yard. There was a woman's voice sounding very agitated with the occasional shout of a man in the background. My best guess was that the couple was fighting about something entirely unrelated to us, since nobody had come over to complain or mention anything about noise. But I distinctly heard the woman say something like, "They don't deserve that pool, and we're stuck in this heat." It was odd, but since I was hosting guests, I let it slide. The next day, I went to my backyard for a quiet swim. I'd just gotten off work and found my neighbor, who I'll call Glenda, standing by the fence glaring at me. She was holding her arms folded, looking as if she wanted to pick a fight. I offered a polite wave. She returned a tight-lipped scowl that would rival any expression of disapproval I'd ever seen. Before I could ask if something was wrong, she just stormed off. I had no idea what her problem was, but I wasn't about to waste energy worrying. Over the next week, I heard repeated arguments in their yard. At times, I'd see Glenda's husband, Tristan, outside cleaning their grill or setting up chairs, and I always tried to offer a quick greeting. He rarely responded with more than a forced nod. Then came the day that changed everything. I was in my living room when I saw flashing lights out front through the window blinds. A police car had pulled up. My heart skipped a beat, wondering if something terrible had happened on our block. Maybe an accident or a break-in. However, I quickly discovered the real reason behind the visit when an officer knocked on my door and asked to speak with me. The officer's demeanor was professional, but I could sense a bit of exasperation. He said they'd received a 911 call from my neighbor, reporting that I was using my pool excessively and causing unrest in the neighborhood. I was stunned. "Is that even a valid emergency?" I asked, genuinely baffled. The officer shrugged, apparently forced to follow through on any 911 call. He asked if I was blasting music or hosting a raucous party. I explained that I was literally just swimming, or at times having small gatherings that never exceeded local noise restrictions. No glass bottles in the pool area, no loud parties past local quiet hours, nothing of that sort. The officer took some notes, probably realized how nonsensical the complaint was, and left. In the distance, I saw Glenda peeking through her curtains as the cop returned to his vehicle. As embarrassing and frustrating as that was, I tried to move on. But over the next month, the police visited my house 3 more times. Each time they came because of noise complaints or potential trespassing at my pool. Every single time I explained that the pool was on my private property, that I was obeying the law, and that there was no loud music or violation of any local ordinance. The officers, who started to recognize me, mostly apologized for the inconvenience. Meanwhile, I had to keep taking time out of my day to answer the door for what was essentially petty harassment. Eventually, I confronted Glenda. I walked to our shared fence and politely asked if there was something we could discuss to avoid involving the police. She launched into a rant about how she and Tristan deserved a pool more than I did, how it wasn't fair that I had one and they didn't, and how her poor husband was forced to sit outside sweating while I swam around like I was on vacation. I'll never forget that line. She actually said, "He feels sorry for himself every time he looks at your yard because you're out there relaxing while he's stuck in the hot weather." I was floored. It wasn't like I was rubbing it in. I even offered, although at this point it was more out of exasperation than generosity, that if they politely asked, maybe I could let them use it sometime. Her response? "Oh, we wouldn't want your pity pool." At that point, I just shook my head and walked away, realizing there was no reasoning with her. The 911 calls continued. It got to the point where the local authorities politely asked Glenda to stop calling unless there was a genuine emergency. I heard from another neighbor who was friendly with me that Glenda had begun complaining up and down the street that I was hogging my own pool. "It's mine," I pointed out to the neighbor. "How can I be hogging it if it belongs to me?" My neighbor agreed the situation was ridiculous. But rumors were floating around that Glenda was starting to turn her frustration into something more vindictive. I didn't want to believe she'd go further than nuisance 911 calls, but I was soon proven wrong. One day, I walked out to my backyard and immediately noticed a foul stench. Looking into my pool, I was horrified to see garbage floating around. I'm talking old food containers, plastic cups, half-eaten takeout, and smelly leftovers. My pool water had become a swamp of someone's trash. Not only was this an eyesore, it was unsanitary. As I stood there trying to process what on earth had happened, I remembered I'd recently installed a security camera system that covered my backyard. It was a moderate investment, but after the repeated police visits, I wanted some evidence in case anything escalated. I rushed inside to review the footage. Sure enough, there was Glenda and Tristan, both dressed in dark clothing, sneaking into my backyard around 2 a.m. They hauled a plastic trash bag over the fence, opened it, and dumped the contents right into my pool. The camera captured everything in surprisingly clear detail. I watched, stunned, as they high-fived each other and scampered back to their own yard. My blood boiled. I was outraged not just by the mess, but by the audacity of it. They'd trespassed on my property and vandalized my pool, all because they felt envious of my ability to take a swim. I immediately phoned the police, on a non-emergency line, of course, to report the vandalism. When an officer came out to take my statement, I showed him the footage. He nodded gravely and said this was a clear instance of trespassing and property damage, which could potentially be considered a misdemeanor or possibly a felony, depending on my state's laws and the extent of the damage. I decided then and there that I would press charges. Enough was enough. The irony was thick when the officer knocked on Glenda's door to speak with her. I stayed on my property, but I saw Glenda answer. She tried to spin some story about how I must have doctored the footage, or how she and Tristan were just walking around at night. On my property in my fenced backyard at 2 a.m., the officer wasn't buying it. He told them they would have to cooperate with an ongoing investigation. A few days later, both Glenda and Tristan were served with notices to appear in court. At this point, I'd already spent a fair amount of money to clean and refill my pool. Garbage can do a surprising amount of damage to a pool filter system, especially if there's greasy food residue or plastic pieces that can clog things up. But I wasn't stopping at pressing criminal charges. I decided to sue them in civil court for the costs associated with cleaning, repairs, and emotional distress. That might sound dramatic, but it was recommended by my lawyer, who said it would help cover my expenses and send a clear message that this kind of harassment wasn't acceptable. The moment I filed the lawsuit, I started hearing through the neighborhood grapevine that Glenda was now telling everyone I was ruining her life and being too harsh. She apparently believed that all she had done was throw a little bit of trash in my pool. Tristan tried to shrug it off as a prank that got out of hand. But a prank doesn't involve trespassing, property damage, and contamination of my personal pool. I won't lie, the legal process was stressful. I had to gather documents, show evidence of my pool cleaning receipts, and provide the security camera footage. My lawyer was fortunately quite organized and helped me navigate everything. Glenda and Tristan showed up to the first hearing wearing the most sour expressions I'd ever seen. When the video footage was played, the judge's face said it all. He was utterly dismayed by their behavior, especially once I explained the context that they'd been harassing me for months, calling 911, complaining endlessly, and basically invading my personal space simply because they envied my pool. Glenda tried her best to cry and say that it wasn't fair that they had to sit in the heat while someone like me could easily enjoy a luxury they couldn't afford. The judge's reply was scathing. That doesn't give you any right to break the law. During the proceedings, it also came out that Glenda had tried to file a restraining order against me, claiming I was peeping on her. It was quickly dismissed once I produced my security footage, showing that I was nowhere near her property other than from my vantage point in my own yard, which is perfectly legal. She also tried to claim that I was intentionally flaunting my pool in front of them, and that her husband's high blood pressure was made worse by watching me have fun in the water. The judge literally rubbed his temples and said, "That's not relevant to this case." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at the absurdity. As the hearing went on, my lawyer laid out the costs for cleaning, repairs, and filter replacement. We documented everything meticulously, including the chemicals needed to rebalance the pool water, the professional cleaning service fees, and even an extra security measure I installed to protect my pool area from further sabotage. It was quite a sum. Glenda and Tristan tried to argue that they shouldn't have to pay for the new security measure, stating it was my choice to upgrade the system. My lawyer countered that the upgrade wouldn't have been necessary had they not broken in and vandalized my pool. The judge sided with me, stating that their actions directly caused me to feel the need for enhanced security. Ultimately, the judge ordered them to cover all the damages and allowed a penalty for emotional distress. The criminal side also led to them being placed on probation, with a stern warning that any further harassment or trespassing would result in harsher punishment. Let's just say the entire affair cost them a pretty penny. The aftermath was something else. Glenda was furious. On the day the judgment was handed down, she stormed out of the courthouse, muttering loud enough for everyone to hear that this was all one big conspiracy. Tristan, looking embarrassed, hurried after her. It seemed like he'd had enough of the drama. In the days following, their house went eerily silent. No more late-night arguments carrying over the fence. No more 911 calls about non-existent pool parties. Of course, that wasn't the end of the story. With people like Glenda, you never know if they'll calm down or step up the aggression. I was extra cautious, making sure my cameras were all working. I also talked to the neighbors around me, giving them a heads up about the situation. If Glenda tried to spin some tall tale to get them on her side, I wanted them to at least know my side of the story. Interestingly, most of them already suspected something was off about her. A neighbor across the street said Glenda once knocked on their door to complain that the mail carrier dropped off a package too loudly. Another neighbor told me that Glenda had accused them of letting their dog bark just to annoy her. In short, I wasn't the only target of her misguided grievances. Several weeks went by without incident. I managed to relax, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. The biggest relief was not having to look out the window every time I heard a siren, worried that Glenda was calling the cops on me again. I also enjoyed being able to plan a late summer pool party without constantly worrying about a visit from the authorities. My close friends all knew the story, and they made jokes like, "Should we bring earplugs just in case someone claims we're too loud?" Gallows humor, I guess. It felt good to see the situation normalizing. During one quiet afternoon, a local code enforcement officer visited, letting me know that Glenda had filed yet another complaint, this time claiming my pool fence was dangerously high and that it was an eyesore. The officer took one look and said my fence was perfectly within the acceptable height range and well maintained. He apologized for disturbing me, clearly frustrated that he had to investigate such a baseless accusation. I thanked him for his time. As he left, he shook his head and muttered that some folks just like to cause trouble. Knowing Glenda wasn't quite done with her antics, I made sure to keep logs of any suspicious activity. I also verified with local ordinances that everything about my pool was up to code. If she was going to keep trying to find a legal angle to retaliate, I wanted to be bulletproof. I replaced a couple of loose fence boards, repainted the surrounding deck area, and double-checked that my pool gate's lock was up to current safety standards. At this point, I was determined not to give them any reason to think they could push me around. One subplot that emerged during this time involved my coworker, Mila, who became fascinated with my neighbor's bizarre behavior. Mila suggested I find a mediator to facilitate a conversation, thinking maybe we could come to some neighborly truce. While I appreciated her concern, I was skeptical that mediation would help. Still, I considered the idea. I even reached out to a local community resource center that offered conflict resolution sessions. When I told Glenda about it, rather reluctantly, her response was an immediate, "You can't trick me into some therapy session. I know your type." So that was that. No mediation, no conversation, no resolution. Just more hostility. Meanwhile, Tristan seemed to be a slightly saner presence, but he never apologized or tried to make amends. On one occasion, I saw him in the driveway and casually asked if he wanted to talk. He shrugged and said, "There's nothing to talk about," before walking inside. It was clear he didn't want any part of the situation, at least on the surface. But he wasn't about to oppose his wife. I'd heard stories from other neighbors that Tristan used to be friendly. But Glenda's temper and paranoia had driven a wedge between them and the entire block. Though I wanted to move on, the tension lingered. At times, I'd see Glenda peering at me through her blinds or standing on her porch with her arms crossed. However, the ongoing legal repercussions, probation and the civil judgment, forced them to keep their distance. There were no further attempts at vandalism, and the police calls stopped altogether, probably because the judge had warned them that any further nuisance calls could be taken into account when reviewing their compliance with probation. Another subplot. A friend of mine who worked in home insurance heard about my case and mentioned that if Glenda and Tristan had homeowners insurance, that policy might increase drastically or even be canceled after the suit. He explained that many insurance companies don't look kindly on intentional property damage lawsuits. I don't know the end result, but part of me can't help but wonder if that's why they started trying petty ways to harass me, like the code complaint. Instead of continuing major acts, their finances were probably already strained. I have no proof of that, but it seemed plausible given their tantrums over my pool in the first place. Despite their hostility, life went on. I scheduled a big end-of-summer gathering, more celebratory than usual, partly because I wanted to show that they couldn't intimidate me. I invited friends, family, and some of the neighbors I trusted. We had a barbecue, played pool volleyball, and even set up a small dessert station with homemade ice cream. I took every precaution to keep noise levels reasonable. Music at a moderate volume, guests leaving by a respectable hour. We had an amazing time, not a single peep from Glenda or Tristan. No flash of police lights. It was refreshingly normal. In the following months, Glenda and Tristan's presence remained subdued. I began to wonder if they might move away. However, they stuck around, seemingly determined to make their experience here as miserable for themselves as possible. Occasionally, I'd see Glenda dragging her lawn chair closer to our shared fence, glaring into my yard. But since there was a strong legal warning against further harassment, she never confronted me directly. Perhaps she realized that crossing me again would only bring more legal trouble. But the story took another twist during the holiday season. I received a letter from Glenda's lawyer stating that they intended to file an appeal on the civil lawsuit to reduce the damages. It seemed they didn't want to pay the entire sum they owed me for the vandalism. I immediately contacted my lawyer, who reassured me that appeals in such straightforward cases rarely gain traction. especially when there's irrefutable video evidence of wrongdoing. Still, it meant more legal back and forth, which was the last thing I wanted. My lawyer filed a response, pointing out all the reasons why the original judgment was valid. A court date was set for early spring. As I prepared for the appeal hearing, I couldn't help but roll my eyes at the pettiness of it all. Did Glenda and Tristan think they'd magically erase a video of them dumping trash into my pool? Did they believe the judge would suddenly sympathize with their envy over not having their own pool? But I made sure to be diligent, regathering all my documentation. Receipts, cleaning quotes, updated camera footage demonstrating that the vandalism wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of harassment. When the appeal hearing rolled around, we went before a new judge who quickly read through the documents, watched the security footage, and asked a few curt questions. Glenda's lawyer argued that the damages I claimed were excessive. He tried to allege that I'd inflated the cost of cleaning and repairs. My lawyer responded with detailed invoices from the pool maintenance company, along with proof that the entire filtration system had been compromised by the garbage. The judge listened, nodded, then asked Glenda and Tristan directly why they felt throwing trash into my pool was at all acceptable. Glenda sputtered something about equal opportunity to enjoy summer, and Tristan merely shrugged. Their argument was so weak it was practically non-existent. The judge affirmed the original ruling. In fact, he even added a small amount for additional legal fees I'd incurred because of their appeal. Let's just say that was the final blow. Glenda stormed out of the courtroom before the judge even finished speaking. Tristan meekly followed. I breathed a sigh of relief, happy to have closure. My lawyer told me this should be the end of the matter, since they'd have to pay what was owed or risk a more serious legal outcome, like a lien on their home or wage garnishment. Interestingly, about a month later, a large for sale sign appeared on Glenda and Tristan's lawn. Apparently, they'd had enough of the neighborhood, or maybe the mounting legal expenses pushed them to sell. Either way, I wasn't shedding any tears over it. By the time summer rolled around again, they were gone. A young couple moved in, and I introduced myself with a friendly wave and a smile. So far, they've been wonderful neighbors. Quiet, respectful, and gracious. They never gave me a single complaint about my pool. I've since upgraded my security system even further, just in case, and I keep all the legal paperwork neatly filed away. It's a reminder that no matter how civil you try to be, some people can't handle their own envy or sense of entitlement. It's surreal to think that all this started because they wanted a pool and couldn't deal with the fact that I already had one. Their attempts to call 911 over using my pool too much still make me shake my head whenever I remember those absurd conversations with the police. Reflecting on the entire incident, I realize how important it is to protect your rights and your property. At first, I tried to reason with them, to diffuse the tension, but Glenda's sense of entitlement had already grown out of control. In the end, the legal route was the only way to stop the harassment. And while it was expensive and time-consuming, it was also empowering to see that the law was on my side when confronted with such blatant vandalism. I learned a few key lessons: document everything, invest in security cameras, and never let bullies get away with intimidation. Also, be wary of neighbors who show signs of obsessive envy. It's one thing to admire someone's property, but another entirely to claim it's unfair that you don't have the same amenity. At some point, a line is crossed, and it's crucial to take action before things escalate beyond repair. Had I not installed those cameras, I might never have been able to prove they dumped trash in my pool, or at best, it would have turned into a he said, she said situation that might have ended differently. My biggest takeaway, though, is that having something nice, like a pool, doesn't make you the villain in someone else's story. We all work hard to afford the comforts we desire. Glenda's resentment was a reflection of her own insecurities and misguided sense of entitlement. She felt slighted by reality itself, which didn't line up with what she believed she deserved. While I do have some sympathy for people who are struggling, I can't condone illegal behavior or harassment. In the aftermath, I've allowed myself to be more protective of my space and more careful about who I invite into my backyard. The irony is that, before all this, I was quite open to letting neighbors use my pool, provided they asked respectfully and followed basic rules of courtesy. Now, I have to weigh the possibility of another Glenda situation. On the upside, the neighbors I trust have all been supportive throughout the ordeal, and we even joked about hosting a trash removal party to commemorate the day I first discovered the garbage in my pool. Laughter aside, we're just relieved that Glenda and Tristan are gone, and that the neighborhood is back to its peaceful routine. As for the lawsuit money they were forced to pay, I used a good chunk of it to finance some upgrades to my backyard, installed a new deck around the pool, upgraded my pool lights to colorful LEDs, and put in some comfortable lounge chairs. A friend teased me, saying, "So you're basically using their money to make the pool even more appealing?" We both laughed. But yes, that's exactly what happened. In a way, it felt like poetic justice. Their attempt to sabotage my enjoyment of my own property ended up funding improvements that make it even more enjoyable. Interestingly, a few neighbors told me that right before Glenda and Tristan put their house on the market, they tried to get a pool installed themselves. But apparently, local zoning or property constraints prevented them from doing so. Maybe the yard wasn't large enough, or they didn't want to foot the bill. That must have been the final straw for them. I can't imagine living in such a state of bitterness day in and day out, constantly stewing about how someone else's property is better than mine. Life's too short for that kind of negativity. In the end, I feel a mixture of relief and pride. Relief that the ordeal is over, and pride that I stood my ground without stooping to their level of childish pranks and harassment. If I've learned anything, it's that we should never back down when someone tries to trample our rights, but also that we should document our steps carefully and follow the proper channels. The legal system may be slow, but in this case, it worked the way it was supposed to, ensuring that people who vandalize and harass don't get off scot-free. So that's my story of how a neighbor's envy turned into relentless harassment, culminating in vandalism, a lawsuit, and ultimately their decision to move away. It taught me a lot about human nature, legal processes, and the importance of maintaining evidence to protect yourself. Above all, it reminded me that not everyone will be thrilled by your successes or your blessings. But that doesn't mean you should apologize or accommodate their envy. We can be good neighbors without letting others walk all over us. And if that means calling the police or filing a lawsuit in extreme cases, so be it. I'm thankful I came out on the right side of justice this time. If someone reading this ever finds themselves in a similar situation, my advice is simple. Don't doubt yourself. If you know you're in the right, consult with a lawyer, gather evidence, and take action. Bullies and entitled individuals often rely on the assumption that you'll back down. Stand firm, keep records, and protect your property. And hopefully, you'll avoid some of the stress that came my way. For me, life has returned to normal. Summer has become enjoyable again. I'll glance next door and remember the nonsense that once took place there. Then I'll shrug, maybe shake my head at how ridiculous it all was, and go back to enjoying a lazy float around the pool. After all, that's why I have it. To relax, unwind, and not worry about bizarre neighbor disputes. And that's exactly what I plan to keep doing. Friends, thank you. See you soon.